All right, so today we're going to be learning about Adam and Eve. Now, if you're familiar with the traditional story of Adam and Eve, you'll know that these two characters are supposed to be the first man and woman that ever lived. And from these first two people, we get everybody alive today. They're supposed to be the ancestors of everyone. Today, we're not actually going to be learning about the traditional characters of Adam and Eve. Instead, the term Adam and Eve has been appropriated for a different concept, and we're going to be learning about Y-Chromosomal Adam and Mitochondrial Eve. Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve are different from the Adam and Eve in traditional story. First of all, they were not the first man and woman who ever lived. In fact, there probably was never a first man and woman. That's just not how populations evolve. Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve were, in fact, ancestors of everyone alive today, but so were a lot of other people. So that's not actually as special as it seems. We're going to list out a few facts here about Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve, in addition to being, ancestors of everyone, as well as a bunch of other people. We're going to see that these two people, they actually had parents. Okay, they were not alone in the world. In fact, they also had grandparents. And they lived in a community with other people. These were not individuals that lived without any other people. In fact, they were pretty normal, just two normal kind of people, but they have these special titles because of what happened to their offspring. We can look at when these two people lived, and we're going to see that they lived about, we'll say, 150,000 to 250,000 years ago. It's quite a long range, right? And it could actually be older, or it could be actually a little bit younger. So we've got quite a big range here, but it was a while ago, okay? Not that recent. Not only that, but we can compare this to the age of humanity, okay? So how old are humans? Well, humans are about 300,000 years old. So as you can see, they were not the first humans, right? Humans have been around for a long time before Y-chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve came onto the scene. Another thing we want to note is that these two people, they probably did not live in the same place. Not only that, they did not live at the same time. Okay, so they probably never met Y-Chromosomal Adam and Mitochondrial Eve, yeah, they probably never knew each other. So, are you perhaps confused? I understand if you are. We're going to explain who these people are. And the first thing you want to know is that both Y-chromosomal Adam and Mitochondrial Eve are special examples of this concept called a most recent common ancestor. This is a technical term, most recent common ancestor, and I'll explain what that means in just a second. Once we know what that means and we sort of look and see who these people are, that's going to allow us to sort of understand our own human ancestry a little bit better, as well as our own human history. So this concept of Y-chromosomal Adam and Mitochondrial Eve has very deep implications to who we are, where we come from, our history. So the next thing we're going to look at is this idea of what a most recent common ancestor is. All right, so let's take a look now at this concept of a most recent common ancestor, and we sometimes abbreviate this as an MRCA, a most recent common ancestor. Now, the definition here is actually pretty straightforward. It's going to be the most recent individual from whom all people in a group are descended. Okay. So if you have a group of people, maybe in a village, and you try and trace back their ancestry and see how they're related, eventually you might find a person who they're all related to. And the first person, the most recent person you find there is going to be the most recent common ancestor. So what we're going to do now is we're going to draw a little family tree to illustrate how this works. And first we're going to have you. Okay, so there's you. And then we're going to have, maybe you have a sister. And then we have some more individuals. These could be cousins. Right, and then over here, this is going to be your mother, right? You might have an uncle, might have a grandmother, and you might have a great-grandmother. Okay, so here's sort of a simple family tree that we've put together really fast. And these are how everybody's related to each other, right? So here we have your mother, here we have your grandmother, here we have your great grandmother, here we have an uncle, right? And then maybe here we have cousin Al and cousin Bob. Okay, so what we want to look at now are common ancestors and most recent common ancestors. Okay, let's define a group. Okay, so the first group we're going to look at, let's say that's you and your sister. Okay, who are the common ancestors to you and your sister? Well, your mom's a common ancestor between both of you, right? Your grandmother is also a common ancestor for both of you. So is your great-grandmother. So there are 3 common ancestors on this tree if the group is you and your sister. But there's only one most recent common ancestor. That's going to be your mother, right? She's the most recent common ancestor to both of you. Okay, see how that works? Let's expand the group now. Let's say the group is you, your sister, and cousin Al. Okay. Who's a common ancestor to all 3 of you? Is your mother a common ancestor? No, because your mother is not an ancestor to Al. But your grandmother is, and so is your great-grandmother. And of course, the most recent common ancestor is going to be your grandmother. Okay, so we've identified the most recent common ancestor to all 3 of these people here. Now, let's try one more time, and we can see if we include in our group cousin Bob, now the most recent common ancestor will be your great-grandmother. And in fact, your great-grandmother is going to be the most recent common ancestor to everybody in this group right here. Everybody in this group is going to have a most recent common ancestor in your great-grandmother. All right, so this is the idea. And we're going to find that Y-Chromosomal Adam and Mitochondrial Eve are special versions of a most recent common ancestor. But before we get there, I want to talk to you about sort of a problem we encounter when actually trying to measure how people are related to each other. And we use typically DNA testing to see if you have relatives. You can test your DNA and then maybe test your uncle's DNA or your cousin Al or your cousin Bob's DNA and compare it to each other to see how closely you're related. But there is a problem with using DNA that I want to talk to you about right now. Okay, so let's talk about this DNA problem, right? The DNA problem. And I guess the case I'm trying to make is that the real problem with DNA is that it is difficult to use DNA to show distant relations. Let's talk about DNA. All right, so first of all, DNA is, well, it contains genetic information. So all of your genes are in your DNA and they code for different proteins that your body needs to make. And the information is there to basically build and operate your body in the DNA. But not only that, DNA is passed down from parent to child, right? So it is the source of heredity. Parents pass down parts of their DNA to their children, and then those children pass down to their children. So this is sort of where DNA becomes useful for constructing family trees and showing relationships. Let's draw a cell so we can get sort of an idea about how DNA works here. So here's a cell, and a cell is going to have a nucleus, right? And inside the nucleus, that's where we find DNA. But the DNA in our nucleus is not going to be one single continuous long strand of DNA. Instead, it's broken down into individual bundles. And in fact, we have 46 bundles of DNA inside the nuclei of our cells. And these bundles have a special name. So this bundle is called a chromosome, okay? That's basically just a bundle of DNA. So the DNA gets packed together inside this kind of bundle here. And the chromosomes are organized into 23 pairs. In humans, at least, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. All right, so 23 times 2 is going to give us 46 bundles total. Okay, that's how it works here. Let me move this cell around a little bit. Taking up too much room. Okay, so we got 46 total chromosomes. Now, where do these 46 chromosomes come from? Well, they come from our parents, right? You might have here an egg with a nucleus, and we've got a sperm cell with a nucleus, and inside the sperm we've got 23 chromosomes, and in the egg we have 23 chromosomes. You put them together, you get a fertilized egg with 46 bundles or 23 pairs of chromosomes. And this fertilized egg divides, and develops into you. Okay, so develops into you, and all of the cells in your body, well, almost all of the cells in your body contain 23 pairs of DNA, 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 total. And in fact, we could, if we wanted to, we could draw out all 46 chromosomes here. And what you usually do is you number them. So they're usually sort of ordered by size. So you have chromosome 1, which is going to be sort of a pair of chromosomes, right? And then you have chromosome 2 and 3, and it keeps going. And you got 23 pairs. And yeah, you could, if you wanted to, you could draw out each chromosome here, and we'd get 46 total chromosomes. The idea being that half of them come from your father's sperm, and the other half of them come from your mother's egg. And altogether, that gives us all of the chromosomes in our body. All right, let's tuck this into the side here. Shrink it down a little bit and tuck it away. Maybe we can make it a little bigger. So what I want to do is I want to trace through and sort of track what happens with these chromosomes as we go from generation to generation. So I can't actually draw out 46 different individual chromosomes for each cell. So instead we're going to focus on one pair of chromosomes. We'll focus on chromosome 1. Okay, so we'll just focus on this pair of chromosomes, and we're going to look at sort of a mini family tree here. We're going to have a cell, and these cells might be cells from your 4 grandparents. And then we'll have cells that represent your parents. And then we'll have a cell that represents you. Okay, so here's your mother, here's your father, here's your grandmother, here's your grandfather, and you have another grandmother and another grandfather. Okay, let's zoom in here and take a look at what's happening with the chromosomes here with your grandparents. And we're focusing on just one pair of chromosomes, chromosome 1. We'll represent your grandmother's chromosome 1 pair with a red color, and your grandfather will have his pair of chromosomes in blue. Now, your mother is descended from her two parents like this, and so you can imagine that she's going to inherit one chromosome from her mother and one chromosome from her father. And so her genetic makeup for her chromosome 1 pair is going to look something like this. As we go to your father, well, we're going to find something very similar, right? Your grandmother on your father's side, so his mother, we'll draw here with purple, and then his father will draw with yellow for his chromosome here. And your father will inherit half of his genetic information from his father and half from his mother. And so this is what his genetic makeup is going to look like. He'll have two chromosomes, sort of like that. Okay, so we're tracking the descent here from generation to generation for chromosome 1. Okay, now here's the question. Your father and your mother meet and they make you. What does your genetic makeup look like? What does your pair of chromosome 1 look like? Well, that's kind of hard to tell. You know, maybe you get the red one here, maybe you get the purple one here. You know, is this what you look like? No, it's not. In fact, that's wrong. That's wrong, 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 wrong. Why is this wrong? Well, it's wrong because things are a little bit more complicated than I let on. So let's make some room here and see what's actually happening, or at least more detail. What actually happens here is this cell is not going to combine with this cell to make you. Instead, your mother is going to create eggs and your father is going to create sperm. So let's look at how that happens. Well, the first step is that this cell does not directly become an egg. Instead, there's an intermediate step, and I'm simplifying here. It's actually a little bit more complicated than what I'm letting on, but essentially what happens is, in this step, the two chromosomes here that make up the pair for chromosome 1, they wind up touching each other, and some of the genetic information from one chromosome crosses over and combines with the other. And so what you wind up having is, after that step is done, is you might have two chromosomes that look sort of like this. So now each individual chromosome contains information from your grandmother and your grandfather. And then what happens is you get eggs from here. And each egg here contains one of these chromosomes. Sort of like that. Okay, so here's where we get the eggs. And this step here where the genes sort of mix and recombine, we call that genetic recombination. Okay, and that's a very important step right there. And the same thing is going to happen with your father when he is creating sperm. There's going to be a recombination step where, again, these two chromosomes sort of touch each other and genetic information crosses over from one to the other and recombines. And it's not exactly always going to happen in the same way because genetic recombination is kind of random. And every time it happens, it's going to happen probably a little bit differently. And the result is going to be here, sperm. And each of these sperm is going to have one copy of a chromosome here for that pair. And so it's going to look something like that. Okay, now we're getting closer to you. So what happens to you? Well, you are going to be a combination of one egg and one sperm. But, again, it's kind of random. Maybe your mother was ovulating this egg, so that's the genetic contribution there. And then, your father has lots of sperm. Let's say that it's this sperm that fertilizes that egg, in which case, for chromosome 1, your pair of chromosomes is going to look like this. And this is you. And so when we look and zoom out, we can see that the genetic information from your maternal grandmother gets filtered down and recombined and eventually winds up coming in and being part of you here. But it's only maybe forming about 25% of your genetic makeup. And so the actual contribution from grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents sort of gets diluted down over the generations. And on average here, you'll probably be getting about 25% of your genes from any individual grandparent. Could be a little bit more, a little bit less. Right here, it looks like there's a little bit more blue. So maybe there's, 30% blue and 20% on the red here. But remember, you also have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And so overall, it's probably going to average out to about 25% each. Now, there's a few other interesting things that we can look at over here. So for example, let's say that you have a brother or a sister, right? So this is going to be a sibling. Well, what's your sibling's genetic makeup going to be? Well, your sibling is probably, unless it's an identical twin, we're going to ignore that. In normal cases, your sibling is going to come from a different egg and a different sperm, right? And so it's going to go through, that egg is going to go through a genetic recombination process, and the result is probably going to be something different than what you got. And so maybe your mother's contribution looks something like this. And maybe your father's contribution winds up looking something like this. And so what you can see is even though you and your sibling share the same two parents, your genes can be quite different. And this genetic recombination step is the fundamental basis of the genetic diversity that siblings display. And this is why brothers and sisters are not going to be exactly the same people, right? Another step we can look at here is what happens when you have children. So let's imagine that you find yourself a mate, and we'll just show their chromosome 1 pair here in green. And this is, your mate. Well, what happens is when you have your child, okay, well, certainly we see that, half of the genes are going to come from your mate, but then when you create your egg or your sperm, you're going to go through a genetic recombination step again. And so all of the genes from your grandparents here get mixed up and swapped around, and you might wind up with something like this. In which case, all of the purple parts in this example from your paternal grandmother, all of those purple parts sort of get swapped out with pieces from your mother's chromosome here. And so the genetic information from your paternal grandmother on the chromosome 1 is not inherited by your child. It gets diluted away because of all these genetic recombination steps and addition of new genes from other people. And so this is one possibility, or maybe it could recombine in a different way. And so what I'm trying to demonstrate is how genes get diluted away as generations pass, and it can become very difficult to conclusively show relationships between people that are more distantly related. I mean, you can imagine, you yourself, you're here, and we're only tracking the 4 grandparents, but you have a lot more ancestors than that. You know, you have hundreds, you have thousands, you have millions of individual ancestors in your past. And if we were to try and track that, then your genes and your chromosomes would sort of be, you could think of yourself as like a patchwork amalgam of a million different genes that are put together to form your chromosomes from your ancestors. And because it's difficult to draw that with a limited color palette, it's better to sort of try to quantify this effect using math. So that's what I'm going to do next. Okay, so let's try and quantify what I am calling the DNA dilution problem. And to do this, let's start out by drawing a little family tree. So again, we're going to start with you, right? You're right here. So this is you. And you're going to have a mother and a father. And of course, each of them is also going to have a mother and father. And each of them is also going to have a mother and a father. And it keeps going. It keeps going back and back and back. And so we can draw out how everybody's related to each other, and it keeps going back, but let's end it right there. Okay, so this is sort of what we're looking at here. These are going to be your parents' generation, right? This is your grandparents' generation. This is going to be your great grandparent generation over there. Now, what I want to do is I want to try and start quantifying some effects that we're going to see. Let's look and see. First, we're going to try and number the generations. Okay, so we might have different generation numbers. And for each generation, we want to see how many ancestors do we have in each generation, and also what percent of the DNA do you get per ancestor in that generation, right? So this is what we want to do, make a little chart here of these numbers. Now this family tree is a little bit big, so I'm gonna shrink it down just a little bit so that we can fit in some more information here. And we might look at you as generation 0. Your parents would be generation 1. Grandparents would be 2 generations away from you, right? So this is generations into the past. Great grandparents, 3 generations into the past. And then it keeps going, right? We can look at lots and lots of generations into the past if we want to. All right, so for generation 0, you don't really have any ancestors. So I guess you could, if you wanted to, you could say you have 100% of your own DNA. That makes sense. For one generation in the past, you have 2 parents, right? So you're going to have 2 ancestors here. Your grandparents' generation, we have 4 ancestors. Here we have 8, right? And what you see what happens is each generation in more doubles the number of ancestors. So in the next generation here, we're going to have 16, then 32, then 64, 128, and then 256, and then 512, and then 1024, right? It keeps going. It gets bigger and bigger as you have more and more ancestors for each generation. Okay, now how much DNA is each ancestor going to give you? Well, your parents are going to give you 50-50, right? So you're getting 50% from each. That's 1/2, right? You have 2 total, so each one of them gives you 50. For your grandparents, each grandparent is going to give you 1/4 of your total genetic information. So that's 25%, right? Then we get 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/64, 1/128, and 1/256. And each time this number, this percentage, gets cut in half. So we have 12.5%. Here we're going to have, I'm going to round it, about 6%, right? Here's going to be about 3%, about 1.5%. Let me draw 5%. Here's going to be about 0.8%, and here's going to be about 0.4%. So this is sort of the percentages that each ancestor you can expect on average to pass down to you. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that 0.4%, 0.8%, that's less than 1%, right? That's a very small number. And if we were to look back, let me just move this a little bit. This is very small, right? And when we looked here, we saw that how you could actually lose genetic information. Your paternal grandmother's, her contribution to your child sort of disappeared because of all of these repeated steps of recombination, right? And so it's possible that when you have slightly uneven amounts of inheritance coming from parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, that if you're getting down to where you're expecting on average of less than 1% of the DNA to actually reach you, there's a good chance that this is almost zero. In fact, it might be zero. And so when you go back 7 or 8 generations, maybe even 6, you might find that some of those ancestors have zero DNA contribution to your genome. And so this is sort of showing how the DNA gets diluted after a couple of generations. I want to show how this actually impacts more than just your past ancestors. So let's move things around a little bit here. Let's bring this lovely family tree down there, and we've got this chart. We want to keep that chart, but we'll tuck it away over here. Okay, now let's draw another family tree for yourself. And we're going to have you over here. This is you, right? And then we're going to have maybe your sister comes back. And then we're going to have cousin Al. And here we have cousin Bob. And here we have cousin Kathy. Okay, so we got a lot of cousins here. Let's move you all up a little bit, just so we have some more room. And let's look and see how you are all related to each other. Well, certainly we're going to have your mother over here. And you have a relationship here, right? So this is going to be your mother. And let's draw some more people here to show how everybody's related. Uncle. Okay, let's draw the lines. Okay, so we've got your mother. This is going to be your grandmother. This is your great grandmother, and this is going to be your great great grandmother. Right here, you've got an uncle and all your cousins over there. So this gives you sort of a little layout of your family tree. Now, the question is, how much DNA do you share with other people in your family? Okay, how much DNA do you share with your mother? Well, your mother is one generation away from you. So if we look here, one generation away, your mother is going to share 50% of your DNA. Okay, you've got 100% of your own DNA. What about your sister? How much DNA do you share with your sister? Now, this is an interesting question because if we look at this diagram, your sister is 2 generations away from you. And so 2 generations away is going to be 25% of your DNA is going to be shared. But this is wrong because we're forgetting something. We are forgetting, well, who do we always forget? We forget your father. All right. You are also related to your sister through your father. And so you're sharing 25% of your mother's DNA, but you're also sharing 25% of your father's DNA, giving you a total of 50% DNA shared with your sister. And this is very complicated math, and I don't like that. So what we're going to do is we are going to pretend or assume that all of the siblings in this graph are half siblings. Okay, so there's no full-blooded siblings in this graph, just to make the math a little bit easier, and we can sort of ignore all of the fathers. In that case, if this is actually your half sister, then the math works, and you will be sharing 25% of your DNA with your half sister. And we can count the number of generations distant. We can see that this is going to be 2 generations away from you, right? 1, 2 generations. Your mother is going to be 1 generation away from you. So we just go back to this graph, 1 generation, 50%, 2 generations, 25%. Okay, so let's look at your grandma. Okay, your grandma is going to be 2 generations away from you. And so again, that's going to be 25% DNA shared, right? Your great grandmother is 3 generations. Your great great grandmother is 4 generations. And so we just go on this graph and we see 3 generations going to be 12.5%. This is going to be about 6% shared DNA with you. So as you see, as you go back further and further in time, it's going to become more difficult to show that you're related to those distant ancient people. But not only that, let's look at how closely are you related with cousin Al? Well, with cousin Al, let's count the generations. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 generations separating you with cousin Al. So you're 4 generations apart, and that means 6%. So even though cousin Al is your first cousin, he's only as related to you as your great great grandmother is. So even though we're in the same generation, you're alive at the same time in the modern day, he's actually not super related to you. I mean, 6%, you do a DNA test, yeah, you'll be able to measure that. But what about cousin Bob, right? He's even further away. He's going to be an extra 2 generations because he's related to your great grandmother. So instead of being 4 generations away, he's 6 generations away. Well, 6 generations Looks like that's going to be only 1.5% shared DNA. And then if we go to cousin Kathy and we count, it's going to be an extra 2 on top of cousin Bob, so that's 8 generations. Well, that's the very top line here. You can see you're only sharing 0.4% of your DNA with cousin Kathy. And you can imagine that if you expand this out, you have a village somewhere. Everybody is distantly related to each other, but the actual amount of DNA that they share might not be a huge amount. 0.4%, as we said, is close to zero, right? Close to zero. It's almost zero. It might be zero. And so for sort of distant cousins alive today, at the same time as you might have a very, very difficult time showing that you're related to each other. This is the DNA dilution problem. And the reason why I'm proposing this problem is because our whole thing is we're going to try and show how you are related to this kind of genetic Adam and Eve. And how is that possible? Like, how can we show this if your DNA gets diluted out, your common DNA gets diluted away so quickly and so easily? How can you possibly show that everybody in the world is related to these people who lived 150,000 years ago when you can barely show genetic relationships between any two people today? So this is the problem. And the answer to this question comes in the form of mitochondria. Mitochondria are going to be the key to showing distant ancestry, how people are related to each other over vast spanses of time. So, what is a mitochondria? Let's look at a cell again, our famous cell diagram. And inside the cell, yes, we have a nucleus, and inside the nucleus, yes, we have DNA, right? We've got 23 pairs of chromosomes filled with DNA. But in addition to that, we also have these structures in our cell called mitochondria. And we've got a bunch of them, right? You don't just have one per cell. Usually you have a whole lot more. Okay, so these are the mitochondria. And sometimes you might have heard of the mitochondria. They're often referred to as mitochondria. They're often referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. And that's a pretty good definition. That's a pretty good way to remember what the mitochondria are, because really, what mitochondria do is they take in oxygen and glucose products, and you sort of feed this to your mitochondria, and out comes carbon dioxide, water, and energetic molecules that our body can use to power other processes like moving muscles or building protein. So this is what the mitochondria do, and that's great. Okay, but we don't really care about that. So let's get rid of that. That's not important for ancestry. What is important is that mitochondria, they contain DNA. That's right. If you were to zoom into a mitochondria, you would find that inside the mitochondria has its own little bits of DNA inside. So if you were to look at our cell, yeah, most of our DNA is inside the nucleus, but the mitochondria also have DNA. Now that is kind of strange. And you might ask the question, why? Why do mitochondria have their own DNA? And the story of mitochondria is fascinating. It is a fascinating story that deserves its own discussion. But basically, the idea is that mitochondria, we believe, are very ancient bacteria that the ancestors to our cells, so ancestral cells, ingested these mitochondrial bacteria. But we did not destroy them. We did not digest them. Instead, the mitochondrial bacterial cells were allowed to live within these cells and perform this cellular respiration function to the point where today almost all of our cells have mitochondria in them. And in fact, we need them in order to survive. They're sort of the basic reason why we breathe and why we eat. We breathe to give them oxygen and get the carbon dioxide away, and we eat to feed them glucose. And in return, they give us energy. So it's this symbiotic relationship that we have. Now, an important point is that mitochondria will reproduce. And they reproduce by splitting apart. And we sometimes call that binary fission, right? So the idea here is that you start out with a mitochondria with DNA. And what it does is as it grows, it copies some of the DNA around, so it has multiple copies of its DNA and it gets big. And then over time, it's going to start to sort of pinch off a little bit. And eventually it splits into two separate mitochondria. And each one of these daughter mitochondria is going to have identical DNA because it was an exact copy of the DNA that was in the parent mitochondrion. And so in this way, mitochondria are able to reproduce and spread while maintaining an identical DNA signature within them. This makes mitochondria very interesting. If you remember, for us, we go through this recombination step when we create eggs and sperm, and that winds up shuffling around and diluting ancestral DNA because we reproduce sexually. But mitochondria reproduce asexually by dividing, and so they maintain their DNA over many generations. Now, there's another thing that makes mitochondria very interesting, and that is that, let me shrink this cell down a little bit. Okay, the other thing that makes mitochondria so interesting is that all the mitochondria in your body, they come from your mother. Your father does not give you any of the mitochondria in your body. How does this work? Well, we've got, here's an egg, right? And here is a sperm. All right, you got a nucleus here. We've got some DNA, 23 chromosomes each. And we've got mitochondria in the egg. We've got mitochondria in the egg. We've got mitochondria in the sperm. And, you know, the mitochondria have little bits of DNA in them as well. Well, what happens is when the sperm fertilizes the egg, the chromosomes from your sperm, from the sperm, are going to combine with the chromosomes of the egg to give us 23 pairs, but only the egg's mitochondria survive. The mitochondria inside the sperm get killed off. And so the resulting fertilized egg only contains the maternal mitochondria. This is huge. What this means is, let's shrink this up. If we were to say, let's copy this family tree right here. Perfect. Okay, so now let's take a look at this family tree, and we're going to try and track all of the mitochondria, the mitochondrial contributions. So let's erase these generation numbers so it doesn't get confusing. Okay, so mitochondria come from your mother, and your mother's mitochondria come from her mother, and her mother, and her mother, and her mother. So if we start out and we say your grandmother here has 100% of her ancestral mitochondrial DNA, she's going to pass that to her daughter. 100% of the mitochondrial DNA gets copied down to her daughter. And her daughter is your grandmother, also gets 100%. And your grandmother passes it down to your mother, 100%. And your mother passes it down to you, and you get 100% of the mitochondrial DNA that your mother had, right? So 100, 100, 100, 100, 100. And of course, your mother also passes down to your half-sister 100% of the same identical mitochondrial DNA. Now, this shows you can trace now back your ancestry very, very far. If you could get a sample of your great-grandmother's cells, you'd be able to analyze and see that it's exactly the same as your mitochondrial DNA. That's because this is a direct matrilineal line, okay? So we have here is, we'll call it mitochondrial DNA is passed through direct matrilineal descent. However, if we notice here, we have an uncle. Okay, here's an uncle. An uncle is not a woman, an uncle is a man. So your grandmother will pass 100% of her mitochondrial DNA to your uncle, but your uncle will not pass any of his mitochondrial DNA to your cousin Al. And so your cousin Al is not going to share the same mitochondrial DNA as you. And that's because he's related to you not through a direct matrilineal descent. It's broken because there's a guy in here. All right, so anytime there's a guy in this change, any man in this chain of descent, that's going to interrupt the transmission of the mitochondrial DNA. But sometimes you do have direct matrilineal descent. So you can imagine if these are all women, right? This is a woman, and this is a woman, and this is a woman, and cousin Kathy, well, it doesn't matter what cousin Kathy is, but she's probably a woman. You're going to find that this person will have 100% identical mitochondrial DNA as you, as will this one, as will this one, as will cousin Kathy. And so even though cousin Kathy only shares on average 0.4% of your nuclear DNA, she's going to share 100% of your mitochondrial DNA. And that's where you see how this mitochondria really is the key to showing distant ancestry, because it doesn't get diluted, because mitochondria reproduce asexually through binary fission, and their daughter cells, their daughter mitochondria have identical DNA. And so as long as you maintain this direct matrilineal descent, you're going to preserve 100% of the mitochondrial DNA from generation to generation. All right, I think we can start to discuss mitochondrial Eve herself. And really, we want to talk about who is she, right? Who is this mysterious woman, mitochondrial Eve? Well, very simply, she is the matrilineal most recent common ancestor to all people alive today. Okay, so what this means is that yes, she's related to everybody who's alive today through their direct matrilineal descent. She's the most recent common ancestor to everybody along that line of descent. Let's try and illustrate what that means. So I'll draw a little picture here. Here is you. Okay, here you are. And it comes as no surprise that you have a mother, right? And your mother gave you your mitochondria. Your mother also had a mother, and she got her mitochondria from her mother. And there's another mother to that person as well, who also passed down the mitochondria. And this keeps going on and on and on, right? There's sort of this unbroken line of mothers going way into the past, because everybody in the past had a mother. That's just how it goes. Okay, no surprise. Now the idea is your mitochondria came from all of the women along this matrilineal line of descent, this unbroken matrilineal line of descent. Now, let's say you are alive somewhere now, hopefully, and you have a neighbor. Okay, here is your neighbor. Hey there, neighbor. Your neighbor has a mother. That mother, his mother, also had a mother, and so forth and so forth. And so there's also an unbroken line of matrilineal descent for your neighbor. And what happens is, if you go back far enough into the past, eventually these two lines of matrilineal descent are going to intersect at a point. And at this point here, you have sort of a common ancestor to both you and your neighbor. And it's a matrilineal common ancestor because it's along this unbroken matrilineal line of descent, right? And of course, you might turn on the TV one day, and who do you see? But it is the Queen of England. Well, guess what? The Queen of England had a mother, and that mother also had a mother, and so on and so forth. And eventually that line of matrilineal descent will also intersect with yours here. And every single person who is alive today on the planet Earth, all 7+ billion of us, are going to have these lines of matrilineal descent that eventually connect up together. And at this point, where finally every single person's line of matrilineal descent connects together. At this one point, this is going to intersect at a single woman. And that woman we're going to call Mitochondrial Eve, right here at this point. And that's going to be not just any matrilineal common ancestor, but the most recent common ancestor on the matrilineal line to everybody. The group is the whole world of people, right? And that's who she is. That's who Mitochondrial Eve is, and that's where she lies. So let's see, what do we know about this woman? Well, we know that she lived probably around 150,000 years ago. This is not an exact number. Maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's a lot less, maybe it's a lot more. Who knows? Well, we try to figure it out. The other thing we know is that Mitochondrial Eve, sort of by definition, had at least two daughters. Why do I say that? Well, if she had 0 daughters, then she would not have been able to pass down her mitochondria. And we know she did. By definition, we all have mitochondria coming from this one woman. If she had only 1 daughter, then she wouldn't be at this intersection point of different lines. So maybe her daughter would have been Mitochondrial Eve. But if she's Mitochondrial Eve, then there have to be at least 2 lines of matrilineal descent that converge on her. And so she must have at least 2 daughters. Another thing sort of worth pointing out is that the idea of a mitochondrial Eve, this concept is more like, it's like a title. Yes, this one woman right here is Mitochondrial Eve by definition, but the title of Mitochondrial Eve might shift and change. It's on her now just because of sort of random circumstances, but it could move further into the past or could move forward into more close to the present day. And so the idea is that this title can shift. It's not necessarily fixed on this one specific person. Well, how could it shift into the past? Well, let's say we discover there's a new population of people that we did some genetic analysis on, and we discover that their line of matrilineal descent actually converges further back in the past. If that happens, then actually Mitochondrial Eve, this title, would shift back in time to that point. Likewise, existing populations might die out. And if that happens, then the most recent common ancestor on the matrilineal line would shift forwards in time. As an extreme example, let's say you have you and your let's say you have your sister here, right? So you're both related to your mother, and there's a natural disaster that kills everybody else in the entire world. Everybody dies except for you and your sister. Well, in that case, Mitochondrial Eve is going to be your mother, right? She's going to be the most recent common ancestor in the matrilineal line to you two. You're the only 2 people left alive today. So that's a very extreme example, but the point is, it's a title that can move based on who's alive and our knowledge about who's alive. All right, that's all very interesting, but I think it raises kind of an interesting question. And the question is, how is this possible, right? Like, this is pretty amazing if you think about it. All of the mitochondria in everybody's cell who's alive today comes from this woman, Mitochondrial Eve, way in the past. Why don't we have mitochondria from other people who are not her? How is it even possible? Let's see if we can answer that. Okay, to see how it's possible that we have mitochondria only from Eve and not other variants from other people, we want to talk about something called mitochondrial DNA fixation. in a population. Okay, so this term fixation, or becoming fixed in a population, refers to the idea that how you can start with many mitochondrial DNA variants, but then you end up with only one variant that sort of takes over the population, right? So this is the idea of genetic fixation, and it can be generalized to other types of genes and other types of things, but here we're focusing on the mitochondria. So to do this, let's imagine we're traveling back in time 150,000 years ago to when Eve was alive. And we have at this time a small human population. And let's draw some of the people here. Here we have Anne. Anne has her own variant of mitochondrial DNA. And then here we have Beth. Okay, Beth has another different variant for mitochondrial DNA. Here we have, is this Kathy? Another variant there. Here we have Deb. And finally, we have Eve. Okay, so we have 5 different variants for mitochondrial DNA at this one time. And all of these lovely women are going to have husbands. So let's draw some husbands. And there we go. Lovely. Okay, so we have 10 people alive in the world 150,000 years ago. Anne, Beth, Kathy, Deb, and Eve all have different variants of mitochondrial DNA. Now, the husbands, we don't color them because although they carry mitochondrial DNA, they cannot pass it down to the next generation, so we won't focus on their colors. Okay, let's pretend now that these 10 people all have children, and the next generation, we're going to see how they inherit the mitochondrial DNA from their parents. Okay, so we'll see that Anne has a daughter, and she actually has 2 daughters. Okay, good job, Anne. Meanwhile, Kathy here also has a daughter. Unfortunately, Deb doesn't have any daughters. Eve has 2 daughters. And let's bring in the crop of men. Okay, so these are all the sons of Anne, Beth, Kathy, Deb, and Eve. And if we want to, we can draw lines to show how where these sons come from. So Beth had actually 2 sons, but no daughters. And Deb had, say, 3 sons, but no daughters. Okay, so what we can see is that after this generation goes past, in the space of just one generation, Beth and Deb fail to pass on their mitochondrial DNA to the next generation. They have sons, so I guess technically, yes, there is mitochondrial DNA here in their sons, but their sons are not going to be able to pass it on to the next generation. So it's kind of lost to the future of humankind, right? Anne's and Kathy's and Eve's mitochondrial DNA, they persist in the population. Oh, delete that. Okay, so let's look at the next generation of the grandchildren. Well, for the grandchildren, we're going to see that maybe this couple here has a daughter. Good job. And let's say that Kathy has a daughter, or Kathy has a granddaughter rather, over here. And then the Eve's daughters here, they have several daughters as well. And so perhaps this is what the next generation looks like, and we add in the guys. All right, so if we want to, we can sort of We'll draw in the sons. In this case, let's say that this couple right here has a lot of sons. Let's say they have 5 sons. So all of the sons here come from this couple. All right, so now we still have all 3 versions of mitochondrial DNA existing in the females of the population. Let's do one more jump. Next generation comes, and in this next generation, all of the daughters come from these 3 couples. And so we can see that all of the daughters are going to be carrying Eve's mitochondrial DNA. And we have sons, right? And maybe we have some sons here and some sons. We get 3 sons from this couple. Great job. Here we are, okay? At this point, forevermore in the future, what we're going to see is sorry, let me delete these real fast. We're going to see basically the same pattern repeat itself forever, right? The next generation is going to be is going to have the same kind of mitochondrial DNA in everybody, right? So what did we say? It was like this. Something like that, right? So what happened in this generation is all the daughters came from these 3 couples. And while Anne's mitochondrial DNA does exist within these two guys, and Kathy's mitochondrial DNA exists within these 3 guys, they're unable to pass it on to future generations. So future generations are going to be every single person, even the guys, is going to have mitochondria that come from Eve, right? So at this point, we can say that Eve's mitochondrial DNA becomes fixed in the population right here, because absolutely every single person carries her mitochondria. All of the other mitochondrial variants, they died out in the population purely from random chance, right? It wasn't that Eve was anything special. It's just that, you know, she had a couple daughters, and those daughters happened to have more daughters, and those daughters happened to have more daughters. And, you know, the descendants from Anne, Beth, Kathy, and Deb, maybe they had more sons and fewer daughters. And so eventually, Eve's variant takes over and becomes fixed in the population. From this point forward, every person in the entire human race is going to be carrying mitochondria that come from Eve. Right. So what we want to say is that Eve is the matrilineal most recent common ancestor in this generation here, right? So if we're looking at this generation here, and we trace back all of the mitochondrial descent, right, through matrilinear descent, it's going to go to Eve, right? Every single person in this is going to wind up, their mothers goes to Eve, and that's why they share all the same mitochondria. But who is the normal most recent common ancestor, right? Remember, the person, most recent common ancestor doesn't really care if you're looking at fathers or mothers. So if we include both fathers and mothers and we try and trace relationships back through time, who is the most recent common ancestor to this final generation? Well, if we look, it's actually going to be this couple right here. This couple is the most recent common ancestor to everyone because they had 5 sons, and all of these sons became ancestors to all of these subsequent generations. And so actually you don't have to go back as far as Eve if you want to show how everybody is related together with a common ancestor. And this is what we find in human populations, right? You don't have to go all the way back to mitochondrial Eve to find the most recent common ancestor. Eve is only the matrilineal most recent common ancestor, following the chain of mothers and mothers and mothers and mothers. And that's a very specific type of most recent common ancestor. I think at this point, there's an interesting question that can be raised. And that is, if everybody has Eve's mitochondrial DNA, if it gets fixed in the human population, 100,000 years ago or something, then shouldn't everyone on Earth have the same mitochondrial DNA like today? If we're looking at people on Earth today, shouldn't everybody's mitochondria be the same if we all come from Eve? Well, the answer is sort of yes, but actually no, right? We do share descent. All of our mitochondria descend from Eve, but they're not exactly the same. Let's see why. So the reason why all of our mitochondrial DNA today is not exactly the same across the world is because of a little thing called mutations. So even though all of our mitochondria ultimately descend from Eve, they have mutated over the many years since then. And in fact, we can see that we can measure sort of the rate that mutations happen. And we can see that mutations in mitochondrial DNA occur at a rate of about once every 8,000 years, right? So if we compare different populations and see their DNA is different, we can count the number of mutations they have, and that can sort of tell us how related they are, how far back in time their common ancestor is. And this idea gives us a molecular clock, right? It can tell us how long ago populations diverged from a common ancestor. So let's try and use an example to illustrate this. Let's pretend we can look at Eve's original mitochondrial DNA sequence, right? We don't actually have this, but let's pretend that it looked like this, right? So we're going to represent it with this purple line here. And like I said, it's important to remember that this original sequence, it does not exist in modern populations. Nobody today is going to have the same DNA as Eve's original mitochondrial DNA. Too much time has passed, too many mutations have occurred in Eve's descendants. So let's sort of pretend we go out in the world today and we sample mitochondrial DNA sequences from a couple different populations in the modern world, and we get something that looks sort of like this. Okay, and what I'm doing is I'm using colors to represent where a nucleotide has mutated, so it's different from the original sequence. Now keep in mind, this original sequence is something like, it's more than 10,000 bases long. All right, so we've got like 15,000 nucleotide bases in our mitochondrial DNA. So having, one base mutate into a different base is not a huge difference. It's way less than 1% change, right? But it can happen, and those differences can accumulate over time. All right, so the first thing we want to look at is how closely related these different sequences are to each other. And you'll notice that this green nucleotide mutation occurs in 4 out of 5. Then this blue occurs in these two. This yellow occurs in these two. This one's kind of an outlier, right? So what that tells us is that these first two here are probably pretty closely related to each other. There's only the white and orange is the only difference between them, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to group those together as closely related, and we see the same thing here, right? They both share this green and yellow mutations. The red and blue, that's really the only difference. And so we'll move those over here. And then this one's kind of an outlier, so we'll ignore it for now. All right, so let's move this around a little bit. And we'll get something like this. All right, let's give some more space. All right, so what I want to do is try and reconstruct a family tree that might show how these modern populations are related to each other. Since these two, the only major difference between these two is going to be the mutations here, what that tells us is that there's most likely a common ancestor to both populations that is the same everywhere else, but maybe doesn't contain these mutations, right? So what we can do is we can represent that as sort of like this. We can try and eliminate this mutated region here. And so what we can see is there's a common ancestor to both of these modern populations that shares the green and blue mutations and the rest of the purple sequence with the modern populations. We can do the same thing on this side, right? The only difference here is going to be the red and blue mutations here. The green and yellow are shared. Those are similar. So the common ancestor should have the same similarities that we see today. Let's look at that. It might look something like this. And we're getting rid of the differences, right? We're just keeping the similarities, right? So this common ancestor shares all the same similarities as these descendant populations that we have in the modern day. And then finally, we can also try and find the common ancestor to these two. And in that case, we see that the green mutations are in common, but the yellow and blue are different. And so we might expect to find an ancestral population that shares the green mutation and all of the purple, but none of the other more derived mutations. So this sort of shows you how we can use modern day mitochondrial DNA sequences to reconstruct what things might have looked like in the past and also show how populations are related to each other today. And now, one thing to note is we still have this guy over here, right? So he seems pretty different from all of these other groups. And so what that sort of indicates to me is that he's probably related to these guys through an even more ancient common ancestor, because he doesn't share this green mutation. He doesn't have that anywhere, so he's probably not descended from this common ancestor, from this ancestor. Instead, there's a more ancient common ancestor that might look like that, right? It might look like mitochondrial Eve's original sequence. And over this amount of time, a completely different set of mutations accumulated, and thus this is related to everybody else through a more ancient common ancestor. And what we can do is we can, in this example, with a limited number of populations, we can use this. We can see that there's about 8,000 years separating here, right? Because this is how long it takes to have this one new mutation show up. And over here, another 8,000 years. And here, another 8,000 years, right? And so in the approximately 24,000 years that we have here, all of these modern populations developed from a common ancestor. Now we can add in even more information because in our example, we went around the world. Let's say this first sample came from a population in Mongolia, right? So we can start putting locations on here. Let's say this sample came from a population in Alaska, right? Maybe these guys came from Yemen. These came from Ethiopia. And let's say this one came from Botswana. Okay, so we can start also using these relations to sort of trace back human history and what it looked like, where people lived, where people came from, tens of thousands of years into the past. And one reconstruction of this might be to say that maybe there was an original starting location somewhere in Kenya where this common ancestor lived. And then those people maybe split and some of them went to what we might call today Egypt. And then people in Egypt split and some of those went to Yemen and some of the other ones went to Central Asia, right? Kazakhstan. And then the people here some went to Mongolia, some went to Alaska. People in Yemen, some of them stayed in Yemen. Some of them went to Ethiopia. And so in this way, we can reconstruct a lot of information about past human history and how people are related that before we didn't know. We didn't have access to this kind of information in the past. This is not from digging up bones or finding pieces of pottery, but it's from examining the modern DNA in people alive today. And it's really fascinating. So let's try and sort of summarize what's happening here. Well, originally, in real life, we have a lot more information than just these 5 samples, right? So the real life tree is going to be a lot bigger. And what we can see is that using this molecular clock in real life, we see that mitochondrial Eve lived around 150,000 years ago, right? A really long time ago. And what happened is her mitochondrial DNA became fixed, right? This is what we saw in the previous slide over here. We saw this process of how, just through random chance, you can start out with many different variants of mitochondrial DNA, but eventually, just because some people have more daughters, some people have more sons, eventually Eve's mitochondrial DNA became fixed in the human population. And once that happens, you have a situation where now suddenly everybody in the world is carrying Eve's mitochondrial DNA. And then from this sort of founding population, you can see that people spread throughout the world, right? So we can see that from this point, people sort of expanded throughout the world, right? And so we all carried descendants of Eve's mitochondria as our ancestors expanded throughout the world. And over time, mutations accumulate in these sort of subpopulations. And this brings us to the state of the world today, right? Mitochondrial Eve exists. Randomly, her DNA becomes fixed in the population. All the descendants from that point forward take her mitochondrial DNA and spread throughout the world. And now today, we have lots and lots of different variations because of the mutations, because mitochondrial DNA mutates every couple of thousand years. So this is the situation. This is who Mitochondrial Eve is, where she comes from, how we can measure where she comes from, and how she influences us today, and how we can use the information in our mitochondrial DNA to see how we're all related in the world right now. All right, so we've talked a lot about Mitochondrial Eve, but I think we've been neglecting somebody. What about poor Adam? Right? We haven't really spent much time talking about poor neglected Adam. So let's fix that right now. All right. If you remember, when I was talking about the DNA dilution problem, right, the whole point was that our nuclear DNA goes through these steps of genetic recombination. And because of sexual reproduction, it gets diluted from generation to generation, where you wind up getting 0 point something % of your ancestors' DNA after just a couple of generations, because it gets diluted away. And that this is a problem for trying to show distant ancestry. It's very hard to do that if the DNA gets diluted away. But I kind of neglected something, and I want to fix that now. So let me steal this little chart and bring that back. And we're going to talk about something here. All right. I talked about how we have 23 pairs of chromosomes in our nuclei, and that is true. However, we really only number the first 22 pairs because the last pair is special. They are our sex chromosomes, right? So if you want to, yeah, we could draw them here. Our 23rd pair is typically the sex chromosomes. Now, why are these special? Well, they're special because we have two kinds of sex chromosomes. We have X and Y, sex chromosomes. None of our other chromosomes have two different types, right? They're all sort of very similar to each other. For women, if you're a woman, you're going to have two copies of an X chromosome, while if you're a man, you're going to have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. And it's worth noting that Y chromosomes are shorter than the X chromosomes. Okay, so that's just something I want to note. So that if we wanted to draw a Y chromosome, we could draw it as a little bit shorter than the X chromosome over there. All right, now let's go back and look at this little graph here. So I'm going to steal this graph. And this is when we were looking at how reproduction happens and how this dilution of DNA occurs over a couple of generations. We were focused on chromosome 1 in this first case, but now I want to focus on sex chromosomes instead. So let me move this over here, and we are going to focus on not chromosome 1, but on the sex chromosomes. Okay, and let's see what happens. Let's see what any changes might be over here. First of all, we'll zoom in and we'll take a look at your grandparents. Okay, so your grandmother looks good. However, your grandfather, he's going to have an X and a Y, and so is this grandfather over here, right? So if we look at this, see, your grandmother has a pair of X chromosomes, your grandfather has an X and a Y, your other grandmother has two X's, and your other grandfather has an X and a Y. Okay, so now we're sort of getting set up. Let's look at your mother here. She's going to inherit one X chromosome from her mother and one X chromosome from her father. Good, okay, no big changes. Now your father here, he actually has a Y chromosome, right? So he inherits one X chromosome from his grandmother and one Y chromosome from his father. Okay, so far so good, nothing too crazy. Now let's look at this next step. Well, not too much changes here, right? These two X chromosomes touch and cross over, you get genetic recombination. So you have two X chromosomes here with the genes scrambled up between the parents, and then each egg inherits one copy of one of these chromosomes. Okay, cool, no big changes. Now, what happens here? Changes. We get changes. Okay. What happens here is that because the X and the Y chromosomes have these, they're so different from each other, they're different lengths, they have different structures. The result of that is there is actually going to be no genetic recombination. Okay, I'm simplifying a little bit, but for our purposes, basically there is no genetic recombination between the X and the Y chromosomes when you have sperm being created. And so the sperm are not going to look like this. Instead, they're going to look something like this. One sperm gets an X chromosome and another gets a Y. So here we have the X and here we have the Y. This is the key difference, okay? No recombination on the Y chromosome. Now, let's look at what happens to you. Well, let's look at two options, okay? Let's delete your sibling, never existed. And let's delete the chromosomes in there. Okay, so this, let's say that this is option 1 for you, and this is option 2 for you, and we'll see the differences. In option 1, let's assume that you inherit this X chromosome and this X chromosome here. Okay, so that looks like something like this. We're going to get two X chromosomes over here, and that's going to make you into a female. Okay, so far so good. Now for option 2, let's say you inherit this egg being fertilized by this sperm. So you're going to get this X chromosome from your mother, and you're going to get this Y chromosome from your father. And that makes you male. Okay, good. So far so good. Let's zoom out and see what we see. Right, now, if we're paying attention, what we should notice is that your Y chromosome, we're assuming option 2 where you're a guy, your Y chromosome is exactly the same as your father's Y chromosome, which is exactly the same as your grandfather's Y chromosome, which is exactly the same as your great-grandfather's Y chromosome. Do you see what's happening here? Because there's no genetic recombination, your Y chromosome gets passed down from father to son without changing. Okay, so if this is you, you get your Y chromosome from your father, and he got his from his father. That's your grandfather. And he got his from his father, your great grandfather. And he got his from his father, and back, all through time until we reach somebody called Y-chromosomal Adam. And this is who Y-chromosomal Adam really is. It's like the male version of mitochondrial Eve. All right, so we can look at Y-chromosomal Adam and we'll see quite a few parallels with mitochondrial Eve. For example, let's go back when we were looking at how mitochondrial Eve had her mitochondrial DNA become fixed in the population, right? What happened was, just sort of through random chance, she had lots of daughters and they all carried her mitochondria, and eventually that took over the entire population. Well, you can imagine the same thing happening with a Y chromosome. And in fact, in this picture right here, you're going to be able to find Y-chromosomal Adam. He's right here. Because this couple produced 5 sons. And those are all of the sons in the next generation. And so that means from this point forward, his Y chromosome becomes fixed in the population. And all future generations from him, from this point forward, is all the people are going to be carrying copies of his Y chromosome. Just randomly, all of these other guys failed to have sons. Maybe they had daughters, but no sons, and so just randomly, this is when the Y chromosome gets fixed in the population, and this guy is Y chromosomal Adam. So this is exactly the same analogy that we have with mitochondrial Eve. And so we'll just note that down. Right? We'll note down that at this point, at some point in the past, somebody's Y chromosome is going to get fixed in the population, right? Just like Eve's mitochondrial DNA became fixed in the population. And that from that point forward, all future descendants carry that Y chromosome. And eventually over time you will get mutations, right? So it's just like what's happening here, right? Here you have mitochondria getting fixed, and then it goes down with mutations. Well, the same thing is going to happen with the Y chromosome. At this point, right, the Y chromosome gets fixed, and then it goes down with mutations into future generations. So it's the same idea. This is Y chromosomal Adam. All right, so we've talked a lot about mitochondrial Eve and now Y-chromosomal Adam. So let's all put it together. Here's sort of the big picture with you in the center, right? So here's you in the center, and for the sake of argument, let's say that you are a man. Okay, now you're going to have ancestors. Let's bring them in. Here's your ancestors. All right, so you've got father, mother, they have fathers and mothers, and they have fathers and mothers, and obviously this keeps going back for many, many, many generations. Okay, great. Now let's look at your Y chromosome. Well, your Y chromosome is going to come from your father, and his came from his father, and his came from his father, and his came from his father, and so on and so forth until we go back into the distant past and we come across Y chromosomal Adam. And Y chromosomal Adam is related to everybody on Earth today. Everybody on Earth today shares, well, all the men at least, what they share is they share an undiluted Y chromosomal descent from Y chromosomal Adam. So it's all copies of copies of copies of copies of his Y chromosome that reach all men on Earth today. I mean, there are some mutations, but it's this undiluted descent. And then meanwhile, on your mother's side, you've gotten mitochondria from your mother, and she got hers from her mother, and she got hers from her mother, and so on and so forth until we go all the way back to mitochondrial Eve. And in the same way, all people on Earth today contain mitochondria that have been descended from hers. So we have an undiluted mitochondrial descent from mitochondrial Eve. And what's interesting to realize is that these are just very special cases of ancestors. You have lots and lots and lots of ancestors in your distant past, not just mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam. You have probably millions of ancestors back here in the ancient past. And some of these ancestors might also be in common to everyone on Earth, right? There are going to be other common ancestors back here. It's not just mitochondrial Eve or Y-chromosomal Adam. If you go back 100, 200,000 years in the past, you'll probably find a lot of people that are common ancestors to everyone on Earth today. The only difference is that you don't have this undiluted DNA from them. You have heavily diluted nuclear DNA that comes from these millions of ancestors in the past. And that's because nuclear DNA goes through this process where each generation you can expect less and less of it to come from that ancient ancestor. And so it gets heavily diluted from these people. And mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam are just very special cases where you're able to get undiluted descent from them. But they only represent these very narrow slices along one line, right? These other ones, you have lots of mixing and matching, swapping between sons of daughters of daughters of sons. But other than that, you're going to have lots and lots of ancestors in common with everybody on Earth today. All right, so let's look at a couple of takeaways from our analysis here. First of all, I've got these two maps here, and this one shows mitochondrial DNA groups and how we believe they've dispersed over the surface of the Earth as humans have migrated around. And the bottom one here shows the same thing for Y chromosome groups. And it's the same idea, right? It shows how humans have populated the world and the path that they took and how different groups are related to each other. And we're looking at groups of mutations on Y chromosomes and in mitochondria. So what we can see right away is that our first takeaway is that mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes show our past human history by piecing together how the different groups are connected. It shows sort of how we've explored the world. It shows our history, and it shows also our common ancestry, how we're all related to each other. So if we were to zoom into one of these maps, you'd be able to see how you have different mitochondrial groups and how they're connected, and you can see that certain groups are more closely connected with each other than other groups. And what's fascinating is that when you compare the mitochondrial map with the Y chromosome map, you actually wind up getting very similar overall results as far as where we came from, where we went, how we split off, how we got together. And so this is a great check that these effects are real, that when we look at mitochondrial DNA and we try and connect that with human past, human history, and common ancestry, that the connections we're making are real because they're echoed in the Y chromosome, which is completely independent from the mitochondria. I mean, it's not echoed completely, but the broad strokes are there. And this whole idea of, our ancient human past and history is a really, really fascinating story that is worth its own discussion in its own right. One thing we can see is that both mitochondria and Y chromosome DNA show that the origin point of modern humans is in Africa. Now, it's hard to say where in Africa. That's really hard to say, but everything points to it being in Africa, right? We can see that this is the origin point for mitochondrial DNA, and here we have the oldest branches for the Y chromosome. Using different kinds of molecular clocks and comparing different mutations together, it looks like that's around 250 to 300,000 years ago. So quite a while. We've been around for a long time. When we look at Y chromosomal Adam, we want to remember Y chromosomal Adam, what it really means to be this person. He is the patrilineal, most recent common ancestor for everybody alive today. And when we look at Mitochondrial Eve, she is going to be the matrilineal, most recent common ancestor to everybody alive today. Okay, and we've discussed what this means. Y chromosomal Adam, again, it's hard to say exactly when this guy was alive, but about 250,000 years ago is a reasonable estimate. And for Mitochondrial Eve, something around 150,000 years ago, but the error bars on this are quite large. So as we looked at our previous graph here, right, the patrilineal line here going all the way back eventually connect you to Y chromosomal Adam, and the matrilineal line for everybody in the world eventually leads back to Mitochondrial Eve. Now, we also want to remember that these are essentially titles, right? So Y chromosomal Adam and Mitochondrial Eve, although they are people, they are individual people, they're people that hold this title, right? So these are more like titles that can change, and they have changed over history, right? You can imagine if we go back here when we were talking about Eve, right? She's Mitochondrial Eve to us now, right? To this population that descended from here because her mitochondrial variant became fixed in the population. But back 150,000 years ago, this Eve was not the matrilineal most recent common ancestor to everybody alive at her time. Obviously, she wasn't the ancestor to Deb or Kathy. She wasn't the ancestor to her mother. So during this generation, somebody else in the more distant past would have had the title of Mitochondrial Eve. So this title changes. It changes over time, right? And it can move forward or it can move backwards along this timeline as our knowledge of who's alive changes and as the actual groups of who's alive changes. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam this title might get shifted around and put onto different people. So yes, the main things here is that we could, for example, we could discover new populations of people alive today that are maybe more distantly related to us. That could push these titles back in time, or existing populations that we have now could die off, right? If these populations die off, then Mitochondrial Eve, Y-Chromosomal Adam, that title will be shifted forward to a more recent person. And the other thing is that the actual most recent common ancestor to all people alive today is probably not Y-chromosomal Adam or Mitochondrial Eve. It's probably somebody who lives a lot more recently. As we looked at this graph here, we have lots of individual ancestors here. We have, perhaps you go back enough generations, you're going to have 1 million ancestors in your past. So the chances are that we'll find somebody in between this pure patrilineal line and this pure matrilineal line. We'll find somebody in between there that's the most recent common ancestor for everybody alive today, more recent than Adam or Eve. And there's been some statistical analysis done to try and figure out how old the most recent common ancestor to mankind might be. And surprisingly, this person might be less than 3,000 years old. So if you actually want to go back and find somebody that we're all related to, you might only have to look back a few thousand years, which is kind of crazy. And if you think about it, for example, after 20 generations, how many ancestors are you going to find in potential ancestors if you go back 20 generations? Well, in that one line, that's going to be 2 to the 20 power for this single generation 20 generations ago, and that's going to equal about 1 million potential ancestors just for generation 20, right? That's a lot of people, okay? So you can imagine each generation is about 20 years, so 20 generations, only 400 years, right? We can go back in history several thousand years, and the number of potential ancestors that you have is just huge. And so there's a really high chance that somebody out there is related to everybody else alive today. Those are some really interesting takeaways, but I have one last question I want to pose, and that is, can we use all of this understanding of ancestry and genealogy and DNA, can we use this to go back further? Right? We can see, yeah, okay, I get it. We're all related. There are these titles for people in the past, most recent common ancestor, stuff like that. But can we take that idea, that concept, further back in time? And I think we can. So let's start out with another simple little family tree here. And we're starting out here with maybe you. There you are. All right, you've got your sister. Great. Right, and then maybe you are related with your sister to your mom, right? Maybe you have a cousin over here and an aunt, right? And here you have your grandma, right? Well, that's great, okay? That's really great. We know what happens as we take this back, right? You've got your mom, your grandma, and as we take this back far enough, we're going to eventually reach someone here, and this person might be the most recent common ancestor to everybody alive today. And to get there, how far do we need to travel back in time? Well, probably need to travel about 3,000 years to get to that person. Cool. Okay, we keep going back, and maybe we'll hit another person. Maybe this person will be Mitochondrial Eve. And as we said, probably take us about 150,000 years into your ancestry to reach mitochondrial Eve. But eventually, we will. And maybe we can keep going back. Let's do that. What happens if we keep going back? Well, we might reach someone, and this person might not seem exactly like us, right? Because it's really old. Let's say we're going back in time now, 800,000 years, right? That's a long time. Now, this person, interestingly enough, winds up giving several lines of descent from this person. One might wind up coming down to mitochondrial Eve and you, but other lines of descent might come down to something that we would recognize as a Neanderthal, right? So not even what we would maybe consider human anymore would be related, descended from this person, right? And obviously this line has now died out. Neanderthals are extinct. They no longer are alive today. So we have to go back about 800,000 years to find a common ancestor with Neanderthals, right? Let's keep going. Okay, we're going to keep going back in time, and now we're going back really far, okay? We find some kind of creature over here, and maybe we're looking back in time about 6 million years. Okay, for 6 million years, what do we get? Well, we might get a common ancestor between us and my really bad drawing of a chimpanzee. Right. So yes, we are related with chimpanzees, but to find the common ancestor, we have to go back in time very far, about 6 million years. Well, let's keep going. Let's keep going. This is fun. I like it. Okay, so we're going to keep going. And, eventually we might reach an animal that doesn't look human at all because I can't really draw. Okay, here's an animal. Maybe it looks sort of like a rodent. Maybe, how far back are we traveling now? We're probably traveling back in time about 100 million years. Okay, now at this point, this is a common ancestor between us and what? Well, we might have cats, right? Okay, definitely can't draw. Here's a lovely cat, right? Whiskers. There you go. There's a kitty. Okay, yes, we're related to cats. And somewhere along this line is another animal, maybe. Okay, it's supposed to be a dog, but looks like an elephant. Mr. Dog. Okay, Mr. Dog is over here. Yes, we are related to cats and dogs, and cats and dogs are related to each other with some kind of common ancestor back here. But we would have to go back in time, maybe 100 million years before our ancestor and the ancestor of cats and dogs winds up being the same individual organism, right? And we can keep going. We can keep going. What happens when we keep going? Well, we might find something back here. Hard to say what it is. We'll find something back here. And if we see the different lineages that came out of here, we might discover that this has several lines of descendants. One of them would be perhaps it is, yes, it is a carrot. So yes, you are related to carrots. Carrots are related to you. Carrots are related to dogs and cats and chimpanzees and Neanderthals because we're all related. We would have to go back in time, though, a very long distance, maybe 1.5 billion years before our ancestor and the ancestor of carrots winds up being the same organism. So our common ancestor with carrots is about 1.5 billion years old. And let's just keep going. How far back can we take this? Well, we take it back all the way until we reach what we call Luca. Okay, now Luca also has ancestors, right? Luca is not the first form of life on Earth, but Luca stands for the Last Universal Common Ancestor for everything alive today, right? So it's sort of like the most recent common ancestor. You could say that too. Most recent common ancestor for all life. Universal most recent common ancestor, or last universal common ancestor. And so Luca is the point in which we are related, is the common ancestor to everything. So once we get back to this point, everything branches off ultimately somewhere from Luca or down below, right? And so we'll have other branches from Luca that maybe go to things like bacteria, stuff like that. So Luca is really old, and if we try and put a date on Luca, it's probably going to be about 3 to 4 billion years ago, right? So we have a lot of time has passed between Luca and now, right? So it's about 3 to 4 billion years in the past in our line of ancestry before we reach Luca. And the idea is that all life on Earth today descends from Luca, which is pretty wild. So it doesn't matter what you're looking at out there. If it's alive, we're related to it. And we all somehow were descended from this last universal common ancestor. Now, what did Luca look like? Well, almost definitely, Luca was some kind of single-celled organism, right? You have to imagine it is ancestral to bacteria, okay? So when we look at bacteria today, that'll give you a lot of constraints on what Luca must have been like. And again, just like Mitochondrial Eve, Luca is a title, right? That could change over time. And Luca was not the first living organism, right? Luca had parents, right? This line continues into the past there. It had ancestors. It had, right? It had contemporaries. There were other living organisms, other living cells alive at the time of Luca. But it just shows how everything ties together. And we can analyze the DNA of different plants and animals and bacteria to really try and figure out what Luca must have been like, or put constraints on what it was like. And this kind of analysis allows us to understand our own history and how we, as the human race, came out of Africa and wandered across the world and colonized the planet. And we can also see similar things in how other living organisms, from plants and animals, fungi, archaea, bacteria, how everything is related, and the voyage that everything has sort of taken over billions of years as life on Earth.